And then when it came to talking about strategy, everyone was always a little confused. It's like, yeah, we sort of know what it is, but it's also hard to know. And what does it do? Is it really helpful? And I was so surprised with this, because when you get together with accountants, they're not confused about what accounting is. When you meet marketing people, they're not confused about what marketing is.
Put that coffee down.
Creators are leaders. Be careful what kind of leaders you're producing here.
Helen, we're both in sales. Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman.
They realized that to be in power, you didn't need guns or money or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on.
Well, hello there, friend. Welcome back to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Bradley Hartman. I'm excited to bring to you today my conversation with Dr. Felix Oberholzer-Gee. Yes, that is one full name, and it's amazing. I will explain later. And we're talking about his new book called Better, Simpler Strategy, a value-based guide to exceptional performance. Now, if I were to tell you we were going to have a tenured Harvard professor join the show to talk about strategy, I can understand. If that did not seem super appealing to you, it might seem a little bit dry, it might seem a little theoretical, and maybe not something you would be able to apply immediately. And yet, you, my friend, you're in for a treat, because Dr. Felix Oberholzer-Gee is easy to talk to. He's fun to talk to. He's obviously smart, but you're going to see what we talk about here is immediately applicable, and this framework of a value stick is what this book is based on. Really takes strategy, which can be complex and potentially confusing, and really simplifies it down in a way that can help you and your team really understand what might move the needle to increase your competitive advantage and help you make more money. So who is Dr. Felix Oberholzer-Gee? He is the Andreas Andresen Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. He's an award-winning instructor, which I think you're going to understand why. He's funny. He's easy to talk to. He's interesting. So his academic work has been published in the very best peer-reviewed journals of his profession, which you nor I have probably ever read. He currently teaches competitive strategy in executive education programs, such as the Harvard General Management Program. He also serves as the faculty chair of the Senior Executive Leadership Program for China and the Driving Digital Strategy Program. He is also the co-host of the popular HBR Presents podcast, After Hours. So how did he end up on the Construction Leadership Podcast? Well, real simply, I was listening to another episode, and another really smart guy whose name I had forgotten, he briefly gave the overview of this idea of the value stick. And the value stick operates on the high end, is willingness to pay. And how can you increase your customers' willingness to pay for your services by doing things that delight them? And on the bottom of the value stick is willingness to sell, which is what is the minimum dollar value your suppliers and your employees will require to want to be able to work for you. So if you can imagine just a vertical line, what we're trying to do on the top end is really extend that line north to increase willingness to pay by doing things that make your customers delighted and say, my God, this is totally different. This is why we are willing to pay more. Meanwhile, what can you do both financially and otherwise to decrease willingness to sell, where suppliers will say, I will charge you less to work with you gladly because you do this and this. And employees say, financially, I will accept less to work with you because you have all these other ways that you deliver me value. And what you're doing is you're grabbing the top end of that stick and increasing willingness to pay. And down at the bottom, we are dragging down this willingness to sell. And in the middle, between willingness to pay and willingness to sell, is the value that you create. Obviously, you have cost, you have price, you have margin. So those are relevant there, but that's really it. And it has proven for me to be a very simple filter about this new idea that I have or something that we want to do, and running it through, will it either A, increase willingness to pay by further delighting customers? Will it make our employees more excited to work with us and keep them longer, right? Or will it lower willingness to sell? Will it be more attractive for suppliers to require less to work with us and deliver great work? And same thing for our employees. And as you run this idea about what you could potentially do to achieve your goals, i.e. your strategy, it's a really nice filter to say, if it's not going to do one of those three things, increase willingness to pay for our customers, or make it better for our suppliers, or make it better for our employees, why are we doing it? And this has already helped our company. So in this conversation, Dr. Felix and I, we touch on a few of these things on how to increase willingness to pay through increased products and services, or complements, or network effects. And then how do you decrease willingness to sell through employee satisfaction, or lower supply costs, or improving productivity. Bottom line, I could not recommend his book, Better, Simpler Strategy, more. This is one of the few books every year that I buy the book, I start reading it, and I realize this is definitely worth more of my time and attention. So then I go to Audible and I buy the audio book as well. And I go back and forth. If I'm in the car or traveling, I listen to it, and then I go back to the book. It's a really good way to really dive into the details and learn. And once I did that, I said, I got to connect with this guy. And I just found his email online and pinged him, and he got back right away. And you're going to hear, he seems like a really generous, authentic person who can certainly help us all think better. So I'm going to quit rambling about my new friend, Dr. Felix Oberholzer-Gee, and his book, Better, Simpler Strategy, a value-based guide to exceptional performance. As always, thank you for listening. Dr. Felix Oberholzer-Gee, welcome to the show.
It's fabulous to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
You have one of the most delightful names I've ever had the privilege of saying on the show. The Felix, the Oberholzer, the G's. I have to start here. Tell me a little bit about where you grew up, your family. When did the Olberholzers connect with the G's? Maybe give me and our audience just a little bit of context.
Okay, I'm happy to do so. And it's very funny. I don't often hear the word delightful in connection with my name. It's mostly super intimidating. How on earth you say this thing? So as you probably can tell from my accent, I grew up in a German-speaking country. So I grew up in Switzerland, just a little south of Zurich. And Oberholzer is a place. It just means above the woods. It's basically a group of people who grew up in a small town that is located above the woods. So that's where my family name comes from. And then in Switzerland, it's very common to hyphenate names once you get married. And so G is the name of my wife. She is Chinese. It's a common Chinese name. And so we just put the two things together, and it created something that, lucky for me, you find delightful.
I do. Well, I bought, by the way, your book, Better, Simpler Strategy, that I heard on a podcast, and just the way that somebody else described it. I think that's one of the things I would just congratulate you on. You took something that can be complex and somewhat confusing, made it simpler, and made it a framework and a story that can pass very easily. And I heard about it on the podcast. I remembered the idea of a value stick. I looked it up. I bought this, loved your book. And then I bought it for about a dozen copies, shared them with other people. And every one of them said, I'm fascinated, not only by the title and the content, but also by the name. So I'm glad I asked. I learned a little bit more there. Take me back to Switzerland. You're 12 years old. What are you into? Did you know that you loved academia and business? And my guess is you're probably pretty strong on math. Like, what was happening in your youth that kind of maybe set you up for where you are now?
You laugh because I was completely determined to become a carpenter. That was my lifelong dream. And actually, even today, like I love, and I'm rebuilding my deck right now. It's like every hour is a complete joy. And so I didn't really think I would become an academic. My family didn't really have academics. I don't think my parents probably didn't know too many people who even went to university, because as you might remember, in Switzerland, the most common path of education is you do vocational training. Mm-hmm. And so doing apprenticeships is essentially what everybody does. And then, you're a little surprised when you get an invitation maybe to go to high school, and then after high school, you might get an invitation to go to university, but it's not the common path. And so if you ask me back when I was 12 years old, definitely like academia was not on my mind. I knew a lot about woodworking tools. I didn't really know much about universities.
Well, that will resonate with our crowd of construction professionals and leaders. So that's an immediate way to bridge the divide if people are, like me, intimidated by a Harvard professor who's got a PhD. So good. Well, I'm glad I asked. I'm going to jump right in here. I'm going to read just a section here as we talked about kind of competitive advantage. And I think this will set the stage for us to really dive into the value stick. But early in the book, you write, time is generally not kind to high-performing organizations. When you examine companies that have created exceptional value, you find that the average firm loses about half of its competitive advantage over a 10-year period. To me, that's, having been in business for 13 years now, that's a little bit horrifying. It's also not surprising. Maybe elaborate a little bit on that and kind of the case studies and the work that you've done with your client companies.
Yes. So maybe we can start out with this idea of where does competitive advantage come from? And I think the basic notion that I emphasize in the book and more generally is you should be very optimistic. Basically, any company in any industry, in any country, you should be very optimistic about the prospect of increasing your profitability. It's quite doable, irrespective of where you look in the economy. You see companies that sort of seem the same, look the same. So say, I don't know your experience. If I go to Home Depot or if I go to Lowe's, I know one is orange, the other one is blue, but really, like, how different are they? Mm-hmm. And then you look at the financial performance, you go, oh my God, Home Depot, so much more successful than Lowe's. Where on earth does that come from? And so the starting point is the observation that many companies that look quite similar, so say construction companies and so on, and you look at the financials, big differences. Where does it come from? Really two sources. Some companies are really fabulous at delighting their customers in ways that just differs from what everybody else is doing. So that's one source of advantage. The second source of advantage, particularly important now, because we've had such a tight labor market for such a long time, some companies are really good at attracting employees over the long term. And they get the right people, that people are really engaged, they do amazing work. And sort of these two types of advantages, they often feed on each other. Because I have amazing people, I get to do amazing things for my customers. And then because my customers are so enamored with what I do, I get next projects and so on and so on. So that's this notion of competitive advantage that really comes from two sources. And in the book, I draw this little value stick, and at one end are the customers, at the other end are the employees. Those are basically the sources of competitive advantage. And then the passage that you just read is, it's fabulous if you do this really well, but you shouldn't really think you can rest on your laurels. So what yesterday might have been an amazing experience for customers. I remember when my wife and I renovated a house, and when we first worked with an architectural firm that did these 3D models of what the house would feel like, and how you even felt a little bit like, oh my God, it's as if I could live in this place already, because I have such a good sense. It was a total eye opener. Now, of course, that's totally expected, right? Everybody does that. That's not really special. And so the idea of the passage is you want to renew that competitive advantage on a continuous basis. You can look at the 10-year value as sort of a half glass full, half glass empty kind of story. Half the advantage goes away, but it's also sort of amazing that it's not everything goes away. So if once you have an advantage, some of it persists over long periods of time.
I'm interested just about the value stick, and maybe we can just dive into that and just talk about willingness to pay versus willingness to sell, and kind of a little bit deeper on those three elements. But I'm curious about this origin, because understanding Michael Porter, Clayton Christensen, you are working in the land of giants when it comes to strategy. What was your origin story where you said, you know what, those guys obviously amazing, and I'm probably ignoring or unaware of dozens of other brilliant people that have worked, at the university over time. And then because instantly again, I didn't even see the visual, but when someone just said at the top, you have a willingness to pay, at the bottom, you have a willingness to sell, at the bottom, you have not only employees, but you also have suppliers. Obviously at the top, you have customers. There you go. That's more or less it. Like, yeah, that totally makes sense. And then I presented this to my team, and I, as a founder and a business owner, there's no shortage of ideas. And I said, what if we just run this idea I've got through this? And it did not meet the test. And I said, okay, well, we're going to kill this idea for now because it's not going to address one of those three elements. So when did this idea of the value stick crystallize for you?
So the basic ingredients into the value stick are old ideas. So for instance, if you take willingness to pay, you go all the way back to the 1980s. My colleague, Michael Porter, sort of creates the field of strategy. And one important source of competitive differentiation is, some firms have customers who have high willingness to pay versus other firms. The part that motivated me most, so for a long time, I taught in a mid-career program for executives. And the thing that struck me most is these people had so much experience, so smart, had done amazing things in their career. And then when it came to talking about strategy, everyone was always a little confused. It's like, yeah, we sort of know what it is, but it's also hard to know. And what does it do? Is it really helpful? And I was so surprised with this because when you get together with accountants, they're not confused about what accounting is. When you meet marketing people, they're not confused about what marketing is. Right. There might be technical and practical challenges, but we sort of know what the thing is. And so I was attracted to a formulation and even the graph, which was developed by my colleagues, Adam Brandenberger and Stuart. I was attracted to this because it seemed to encapsulate in a really good way the basic forces that drive profitability. And we had paid a lot of attention to the top of the value stick. Like when I tell you, oh, you got to please your customer, your reaction is, oh my God, like what else is new? Really? I need to go to university to hear that? I've known that for a long time. And then at the same time, I think we neglected the dynamics with respect to suppliers and with respect to employees. I even find today when I talk to people about the value stick, can I tell you interesting things about the top? Maybe a little bit, but more or less your intuition will be exactly right. Mm-hmm. You have an advantage in willingness to pay. You can charge premium prices. That drives up your margins. That's a great story. If I tell people you should think about ways you can pay for employees a little less, they look at me like, who are you? Like, are you crazy? Like, don't we want to be generous with people? And say, no, I don't mean compensation. I mean willingness to sell. How good is the job? Like, what can you do to make work more engaging, more attractive? And there, interestingly, we have completely different intuition. So when I ask, say, people in human resources, like, what's your compensation policy? People will say, oh, we pay market. Say, what exciting things are happening in your firm at this moment in time? They say, well, we think a lot about work flexibility, and we're thinking maybe about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And maybe there's this wave of thinking about purpose. People seem to be animated by purpose. And what's striking about this is everybody's thinking about the same things. Ask an HR person, why should I work for you? They will say, we have a really great culture. Ask them to describe that culture. That's the same description you heard a million times. Yeah. That is at the top of the value stick in the relationship with customers. It's so intuitive for us that we have to be different. If you're not different, you don't have an advantage. At the bottom in our relationship with suppliers and with employees, there seems to be this push to be like everyone else. And that makes no sense strategically speaking, makes no sense financially speaking, but it's actually a tough intuition to break. And so I thought this formulation, this way of thinking about strategy could be really helpful to make people understand that they can fully exploit the sources of advantage that are there for the firm.
Yeah, the other element that really resonated with me, in a previous life, I was a buyer for a national home builder. So I was buying material, I was buying labor for the Midwest. And over time, I realized yes, I was buying, but in some aspects, I was very much selling because when I worked with these people, they were more efficient, they were smarter, they had newer ideas, they saved my time, which was largely a soft cost. They helped us build better in the field, which was absolutely a hard cost. And I remember thinking, okay, on paper, they're more expensive. Even if I could quantify just a little bit of what it's like for this supplier to work for us and make sure we are being really attractive, and heaven forbid we lose one of those, companies, my job got worse. It got harder to build. So can you speak to maybe just a high level? So we kind of hit customer delight at the top end. We got, right, employing, retaining talented employees and trying to think financial and non-financial kind of rewards or incentives. Maybe just talk to us a little bit about it, also this willingness to sell from a supplier standpoint.
Yes. Yeah. So willingness to sell, just like in the employee relationship, it's the least amount of money that the supplier needs to receive in order to be willing to work with you. So say we're negotiating, I'm the buyer, you're the supplier, and I lower your price. At some point in time, you're going to say, oh, now it's just, I love you to death, but like, it's just not enough money. I'm not going to work with you. So that's the supplier's willingness to sell. And generally speaking, in supply relationships, we often strive to create sort of apples to apples comparisons. So if you work in procurement, like what does heaven look like? Heaven looks like I have 7 suppliers. They can do the exact same thing. And so really, I can just look at their offers. I pick the cheapest person and then, I'm in business.
Yes.
That destroys any hope for strategic differentiation. Because what you want is that you figure out ways to lower the cost of your supplier. And if you can do that, if that supplier's costs fall, then there is more bargaining room. And some of that bargaining room will go to the supplier, so they have better margins, and some of that bargaining room will stay with your firm. And so it's interesting that at one and the same time, you will have, as a supplier, you will have lower prices and you will have better margins. You go, how's that possible? Well, that's possible because we didn't engage in zero-sum negotiation. We engaged in lowering the cost of suppliers. One of the things that we at Harvard Business School, we mostly use case studies to teach our students. And so I write many case studies every year. And one of the things that I do when I go to companies, I would always ask the top executive team, what's the cost structure of the most important suppliers like? And then they look at me and they're like, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about? I say, yeah, it's like, it's like when you think about the cost of the supplier, like when they produce something for you, like what's really important, what's not. And typically people have no idea. If you don't understand the cost structure of your supplier, you don't really know how to be helpful to the supplier, but every time you lower the cost of the supplier, that creates that bargaining room that then can give you competitive advantage. So it's a very different way. And of course, do you need to manage procurement in an efficient way? You have to. But if you force everyone, presumably, you said it beautifully, presumably I'm working with suppliers because they know a thing or two that I don't know. Right. They can do a thing or two that I can't do. Yeah. So then the idea that I tell them in great detail exactly what I want and leave them no flexibility, that just really doesn't make any sense. And so we want to liberate them so that they can produce in a really cost efficient manner. And then once we negotiate, obviously that gives benefit to both sides.
Yeah, it has me thinking about these times where I get pricing and I'm like, I do not believe this is the best pricing. And we had an ongoing relationship and I would say, what do we do that makes your life harder or annoying? And they would also understand that we were a valuable customer of theirs. And they'd say, no, you guys are great. You guys are unique, special snowflake. We love you and everything you do. And I said, there's not one thing we do, large or small, that annoys you, that costs you more time and money. I'm like, I'm asking you, we're in a little circle of trust. We're in the trust nest right now.
Exactly.
And then they would say, all right, here's the top 5 things that just drive us crazy, waste our time. And I would say 2 of them I can't address. 1 of them I'm not sure. 2 of them I can make the commitment we can solve today. And all of a sudden, I said, if we can do this, can you lower your price? Yes. So I have first person experience that this is true.
Yeah. And what I love about your story is in these relationships, of course, there is always a zero-sum aspect, right? So at some point in time, if your margins go up, the margins of the supplier will fall. And so we start these conversations from a place of distrust. If I'm your supplier and you say, tell me about what else you could do, like I'm thinking, oh my God, yeah, that's a really dangerous conversation, because if I tell you anything, you're just going to use it against me in that next conversation. And so you see like the best kinds of relationships. So I'm thinking the relationship that Dell has with FedEx. So when people buy Dell laptops and Dell computers and then they're not quite right and they send them back, that's incredibly expensive for Dell, because you have to check the machines, and can you resell them, can you refurbish them, and so on and so on. So they're working with FedEx to do reverse logistics. And the beginning of the conversation is exactly this conversation of mistrust. Basically, FedEx thinks, well, it's like, we know where this will end up. FedEx will ask us for a huge discount at some point in time. And then they really discover these joint opportunities to collaborate and just take cost out of reverse logistics altogether. The net result that now reverse logistics has become much less of a headache for Dell, and it's a pretty sizable business for FedEx. But the conversations, to your point, start from this, I'm not exactly sure, how much should I tell you, and can I really trust you?
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you about underdogs and how they might be able to compete and think about the value stick in different ways. Because in the construction industry in general, there's been quite a bit of consolidation going on. For our lumber building material folks, this is absolutely true. We have Builders First Source. We have kind of two companies that sooner or later will go public, and Kodiak and USLBM. And they're really scaling up, and they're really leveraging these economies of scale. And a lot of the conversations with our folks that are independents are, how in the world are we going to be able to compete if this continues? And meanwhile, in kind of commercial construction, there's still quite a bit of that happening, probably less so. Mm-hmm. So do you have any recommendations when it comes to underdog strategies in relation to the value stick?
Yeah. So I would make two recommendations or two observations to begin with. If you want to build a more profitable business, the last thing you should do is start with your financials. And I'll give you an example why I'm saying this. I have many students who are thinking about building a business, and they have startup ideas. And usually when they come to office hours and they want to talk to me what they want to do, in particular, maybe green energy and so on and so on, like they always start out talking about how they're going to make money. And I stopped them right there and then and said, no, actually, it's all about value creation. If you create value, am I worried about how you're going to monetize? No, of course not, because you created value to begin with. If you have no value creation, there's nothing to capture. You're not going to be financially successful. And so don't push the financials aside. That's not where you start. The second intuition to have is scale, market share, the size of the company, the growth of the company means nothing. You shouldn't start from thinking about, in fact, when I show you a graph, like all companies in the United States or many different industries, and I show you market share on one axis, I show you margins on the other axis, you will see right away, oh my God, there's no relationship whatsoever. And of course, we sort of know, we all know small companies that are really, really successful. And then, we know American Airlines really big, not so much to show for it. So don't start with, just because I'm small, I'm at a disadvantage. And then you can think about what are the kinds of forces that actually give bigger companies an advantage? And can I somehow make up for that if I'm the underdog, if I'm the much smaller company? And you already mentioned one of the forces. In an industry with high fixed costs, you get economies of scale. And then economies of scale means my average cost is going to fall up to a point as I get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the first thing to figure out is, where are you on that cost curve? If your sales went up by, 10% tomorrow, and you're looking at your fixed cost, you're looking at your variable cost, do margins actually increase? For many, many of the large companies, the answer is no, margins don't increase because you're way past the point where you're effectively spreading the fixed cost. So understand where you are. And then I think that just beautiful insight that comes from the value stick is even for companies who are unable to replicate these economies of scale because I'm just too small. I have basically two choices. I can think about aggressive growth. I can think about consolidation, M&A, and all of those kinds of things. Or I can think, let me just shift the locus of advantage to the top of the value stick. So I'm going to have amazing staff. I'm going to be the most reliable construction company in your area. I'm going to provide a suite of services that are unmatched by everyone else. So it's not as though every company needs to have a competitive advantage at the top in willingness to pay and at the bottom in willingness to sell. If you find that you're relatively smaller, you can't basically have an advantage. So your focus really like laser sharp. Every meeting you sit in, every conversation you have with anyone in the company, when someone suggests something, you go, oh, does it increase willingness to pay? If that's not true, end of conversation. Don't even waste a minute anymore. And the intuition is just the way I'm going to compete is completely focused on the top of the value stick. If I may add one thing, it used to be, in strategy, people said, don't try to be low cost and high quality. That's basically a recipe for disaster. I find now that I see many, many companies that can do this. They have both high quality and low cost. And part of it is in the service component of any business. These things are almost mechanically linked. You never got great service from a person who didn't want to be at work in the first place. And so to the extent that you can create employee engagement, to the extent that people can be really, oh my God, this is just my dream job. I love it here. I'm full in. Guess what? The client experience is going to be much better. And so you have a decrease in willingness to sell and an increase in willingness to pay at one and the same time. But you want to think through that relative to the competition where your best opportunities are.
Oh, that's really well said. But it has me thinking something that I hear a lot in construction. I said a lot when I was working for a builder that I completely disagree with now is that they'll say speed, quality, and price. You can only pick two, Dr. Felix. Well, yes. Now I get my own company and with our best clients, our team, we wake up every day and I want to give them all three. And I think to varying degrees of success, we do that. And I think the best people that we work with, whether they're consultants or designers or anybody else, I love working with them because I'm getting a really fair price. Speed, responsiveness is immediate, and the quality is off the charts. So I often hear that in our industry and they're like, yeah, it's unreasonable expectations. Speed, quality, price, you get two.
Yeah.
And I think what you just shared with me, I think that kind of confirms that as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's this old style thinking. And is it never true that there are real trade-offs? No, of course not. There are trade-offs. Sometimes I want higher quality materials as my input. They probably come at a higher price. And so that's like the old style thinking. But there's so many ways you can connect the two. So I would always encourage everyone, if you have an idea how to do a better job for the customers, always think about, would it lend itself also to create more attractive jobs? Or if you have an idea, I could make that job a better job somehow. Maybe it's safer. Maybe it's more engaging. Could I somehow translate that into a better customer experience? And I'm telling you, more often than not, people have like 15 ideas how to do this. And before you know it, magically the value stick expands at both ends.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the value map, and maybe in our short time here, you can help me become a better consultant using kind of the value map and trying to figure out, hey, let's think of our customers. What are their priorities? How do we force rank them? I have found it is not uncommon when I do this exercise with a team, we will list out, speed and responsiveness and price and quality and trustworthiness and smart people. And what happens is when we kind of lay out all these different behaviors or attributes, it's hard to get consensus as to which is truly the most important. Someone will say, well, hey, if we don't consistently deliver on time and in full, none of the rest matters. And someone says, well, that's true, but if we don't have, and it goes around in circles, and somewhere I'm thinking, there's something I am doing leading this conversation that is not effective. Have you ever experienced this? And maybe walk us through the value map and how both as a client investing in these services or hoping other people can help them think better. And as maybe a consultant, we can guide this conversation because I think it's really relevant for everybody listening.
Yes, yeah. So the idea of a value map is to connect these, high-minded concepts, willingness to pay, willingness to sell, to really connect it with practice, right? I think it's incredibly helpful to think about willingness to pay and willingness to sell all the time, but it's also not totally obvious. What would you do on a Monday morning? Well, what? Think more. Yeah. And so value maps help you decide where do you want to invest your resources? Where does an investment in time and finances and so on and so on? Where do those resources go? And the way it basically works is you have a vertical axis where you have all the buyer's criteria ordered in the order of importance, from most important to least important. So if I choose between your construction company and some other construction company, what are the considerations that flow into this choice? So that's the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, you're asking, how well do I do relative to the competition? Timeliness, am I more timely? Am I less timely? On price, do I have an advantage? Do I have a disadvantage? For each of the value drivers, you ask this question. And the map essentially shows you where you have your best strategic opportunities. Now, one of the difficulties is exactly the one that you alluded to. If you ask me as a customer, what do I want? My answer is obvious. I want everything and I want it for free. That's not super helpful if you're trying to make decisions. Should I invest in value driver number one or value driver number 5? So when companies go out and they do the survey work among their customers, you want the survey to be done in a way that really forces customers to make trade-offs. One method that I often do when I work with companies, I give customers, say, 10 value drivers, and I give them 100 points. And I tell them, allocate the 100 points against these drivers. Now I'm forcing you to make a trade-off, because if you allocated everything to price, there's not much else you really care about. In this exercise, I think the most surprising thing is often, or sort of two things that end up often surprising. One is we know what we think about the competition, but we often don't have a good sense of what our customers think about the competition. And it's that second thing that really matters, right? Because I'm choosing between you and someone else. So it doesn't really matter whether you think, oh my God, my competitor, they're so unreliable. If my perception is, no, actually, they've been really, like we talked about this offer and this project, they've been really great. That's what matters, not what you actually know. So there's always a bit of a surprise. And then I find often in companies, there's sort of a narrative about what we do really well. So I'll give you a practical example. I did value maps with a local bank, and the pride of the bank was they were really engaged in local affairs. Couldn't go anywhere without them sponsoring or having a presence. And they thought, they did really well financially. It was thought because we are truly the local bank. The community thinks of us as a local business. So we do the survey, comes back, no one gives a hoot. No one cares about whether this bank is local or not. They do many other things that they do really well, but being local just wasn't really all that important to their customers. And so that's the other value that you get from doing this kind of analytic work, that we know we have to listen to customers, but it's, we have anecdotes, we have stories. This is why your conversations sometimes go round and round, because, so I talked to 2 guys yesterday and they told me, and then someone else tells you something else, and it's hard to aggregate. Yeah.
Well, I think the obvious answer of what you shared there was being more diligent and proactive with gathering data in a kind of constrained way with actual customers versus relying on people in that room. And we probably do a poor job on the first one that leads to probably less than stellar results on the second. So that makes sense. I'm watching the time. I realize you teach class, you have other stuff you need to get to. I want to ask you, looking obviously with what you've read, what you've written, what's behind you with all your books there. I try to write well, and I believe part of that is me reading well. And obviously that's why I really enjoyed your book, Better, Simpler Strategy. As you look back in kind of your career development, you mentioned the word intuition a couple times, about thinking about our thinking, and sometimes where our intuition or our gut or our pattern recognition will go might lead us astray. I'm wondering if you have a book or a couple books, if you look at your career, that you said, man, when I read that book, that changed the way I see the world on strategy or business or life. Does anything come to mind? Because we have a lot of listeners who they are book people. And so I'm just curious if anything comes to mind for you.
Yeah. So I would probably mention one or two. Youngmi Moon, a colleague here, she has a book with the title called Difference. And it's thinking more about the top of the value stick. It's thinking about in a world where, you and I have a great idea. How long really does it take the competition to copy that idea? Usually not that long. Like, how do you outrun the herd? And what's remarkable about her book is not only the insights, how you do this, but also it's so beautifully written. It's like, in particular, if you have readers who love books just for being interesting books, it's like this magical combination of something that is really beautifully written and really insightful at one and the same time. And then Frances Fry, another colleague of mine, she has a book about service quality. And this is building on how is it that sometimes you interact with particular companies and you have these service experiences that are just unbelievable. Where you say, like, what's the secret sauce? Like, and then you think, yeah, probably I got lucky, the circumstances are just right and the employees were in a good mood and so on. And then you go back and you have that same amazing experience again. And so her book is thinking about where the title is Uncommon Service, where these uncommon service experiences come from and how you create and recreate that over time. Thinking back, those are probably two books that have deeply influenced me in how to think about strategy and how to think about lasting competitive advantage.
Wonderful. I will make sure after I buy them, we will put the links in our show notes as well. You mentioned Youngmi Moon. What have you learned from collaborating on the podcast After Hours?
The story is a sort of a funny story. Youngmi Moon, Mihir Desai, and I, we have been friends for a long time. But we actually, if you looked at our calendars, we didn't spend all that much time with one another because, we're busy and I guess we're scatterbrained. And so then that didn't happen as often as we would like. And so we thought, what if we had a project? Like if we had a project that would force us to get together in regular intervals, that might be really good. And so we started this podcast. And frankly, like I thought, I don't know, maybe I could get my mother to listen to it if I'm really lucky. But we had no expectation and were quite surprised when it exploded in popularity. And the best I can say is part of the success seems, so we talk about business issues and cultural issues, but we often talk about things where we are not so sure. We don't know really. We're not the experts in that field. And the conversation is more around how do we make sense of all the things that happen? So say you're thinking about AI and the influence that AI will have on society. We don't really know, but we can speak with one another and try to, what is a good way of thinking about these big challenges that we have, sometimes in business and sometimes in culture. And that seems to somehow strike a chord with many people, that you don't come in with a fixed opinion or a particular view. It's more that sort of we listen to others and then you build on what you hear. And sometimes we end up in a place where we think, yeah, actually we sort of nailed it. And then very often we end up in a place that, yeah, probably you didn't learn all that much from that conversation because it's like three people who don't know talking to one another. Usually the outcome is not all that fabulous. So both things happen, definitely.
Yeah, well, that's what I've enjoyed it because you guys are just kind of talking through it. And it's like smart people thinking about how they think. And what I've found with kind of part of my inner circle is there are often no definitely right answers, but often my line of thinking would fall into the category of, well, I don't know if it's definitely right, but the way you're thinking about that is more than likely definitely wrong. And you're like, okay, where are the big mental potholes in the street that I do not want to step in?
Yeah.
But anyway, After Hours, we will link to that as well.
One intuition I have that has served me actually really well in my career, and it often happens in the classroom. Someone will say something, and my first reaction is, this is definitely wrong. And then I think I always try to start from a premise, someone who's smart just said something that is really surprising to me. There must be something to it. Otherwise, this person wouldn't have said it. And it's more a limitation of mine that I don't immediately see where this idea comes from, as opposed to it's inconsistent with how I'm thinking about the world, and it's got to be wrong. So if that is always, in particular now that we have so many difficulties holding conversations at this point in time, as you know, if you just always start, someone sees something that I haven't seen, someone smart has a particular view that really surprises me, and then try to figure out in the conversation, where does it come from? What are the facts that underpin it? And so on and so on. I have found that incredibly, incredibly helpful.
Okay. All right. I'm going to wrap you up. Make sure we're not late. You teach a business strategy course. It's under $2,000. It happens. It's online. It's kind of self-paced. I'm going to reach out to anyone who's listening that is interested in doing that. I think we can get a good construction mini cohort that can kind of come in this together. So business strategy, all your information is online. You also do keynotes. You were mentioning you consult with all sorts of companies, including just recently a scrap metal company. So if other people like me might be intimidated by a PhD Harvard professor, you say, hey, I can work with lots of people. And I think your sense of humor and your ability to relate with, a humble construction guy like myself, it's been a really fun conversation. Where, if people are interested to learn more about you or to connect with you, where should they do that?
So the easiest way is email. So if you Google me, my email will come up. I'm fairly good at responding, not always as timely as I wish, given the volume of mail, but I'm happy to engage. And in part, I think it's just, there are very few interactions where I don't learn. Like sometimes I feel like even in consulting engagements with companies, I'm probably learning as much as the company can learn from me. And so if there are issues or if there are things that you're interested in, then absolutely. So after hours is obviously a good place to listen to what we're thinking about at this moment in time. And then, I think the most important thing is probably don't be shy. Just reach out and, we'll talk, and in all likelihood, it'll be fun and interesting, and we both get some benefit from it.
Well, that's what I did. I took a flyer, I read the book, and I'm like, I'm prepared for rejection. I'm prepared for indifference. And you got back to me, I think in 24 or 48 hours. And you said, yes, I would love to. And we did this, and this was delightful. So better, simpler strategy. Dr. Felix Oberholzer-Gee. I couldn't recommend it more. This is great. This has really helped me already in my own business, and I know it's helped other people. I think it can help a lot more people in our industry. So thank you for your generosity, and congrats on all your success.
No, thank you for having me. It was really delightful to get to know you a little bit and hear about how you're thinking about strategy and all the amazing things you've done in your career. So it was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. All right, friends, how did that go? What did you think of my conversation with Dr. Felix Oberholzer-Gee? I keep on thinking about what that name would look like on the back of like a football jersey or something. There's a lot going on in there, but Felix was a wonderful person. I'm glad I made his acquaintance, and I want to continue to work with him because if he can help me with, a $23 book, I firmly believe that the course he put together on business strategy can also help me and my team think better. So no details just yet, but here's what I'm thinking. Either later in 2024 or early in 2025, I'd like to get together a small cohort of construction folks. We're going to get together virtually. We all take his business strategy course together. It's 7 weeks long. It's self-paced. There's 6 modules. There's a lot of details online, and you can see some of his example videos. I have zero doubt that I can make back the $2,000 that I would invest in this, plus my time, to help us grow our business better and faster. I have zero doubt about that. So if you might be interested in joining me and some other folks, I think there's going to be some interest. So feel free to email me at info@BradleyHartman&Co. There's 2 N's at Hartman. info@BradleyHartman&Co.com, and just put business strategy, or if you want to go nuts and you want to write down all the letters in Dr. Felix Oberholzer-Gee's name, well, have at it. You're going to enjoy it. Once you start saying it, man, it just rolls off the tongue. So I think this is something that will be interesting and different and will help us run better businesses. Also, bring together smart people from throughout our construction industry. So again, info@bradleyhartmanandco.com. You are not signing up for anything. And no, this isn't a money-making venture for me. I'm going to invest it with our team, and then we'll just pay Dr. Felix whatever his fee is, and we'll just do this together, and I think it'll be beneficial. So, all right, that's all I got. I'm done. Shutting it down. You, my friend, you are owed nothing. Deliver value first. Make it a great week.